tonight. I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You might all notice that you are all muted. That is because we had over 90 people register for tonight, and we wanted to make sure that everybody could hear our speaker tonight. We all have been on those Zoom calls when there's feedback, and we wanted to avoid that. We would love your questions. If you have a question, and Jodi wanted me to tell you all, she is not afraid of any question you have. You can put it in the chat to either me, Liz, or Tamar, and we will read questions at the end of Jodi's presentation. And she will be happy to answer any questions that you guys have. I'm going to put in the chat right now a little blurb about Yachad in case you're not familiar with Yachad. And Tamar is also going to do the same thing about gateways. We didn't want to spend too much time tonight explaining our agencies, but we want you all to know about the wonderful work we're doing. And we hope that you will reach out to us to learn more. If you have a family member or a friend that you think would be interested in our agencies, we would love to connect with you. And I'm going to hand it over. I think that's all my housekeeping. Oh, if anyone would like closed captioning, we have enabled it for this presentation. So you can click on the button that says CC Live Transcript, and you can enable show subtitle. If you click on show subtitle, it will enable it for you. And also this is being recorded, and we will send the recording to everybody who registered. So if you have to leave early, or if somebody couldn't make it tonight, we can share it with the people who have registered. Tamar, Liz, Jodi, did I forget anything for housekeeping? No? Good. Okay. Tamar, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our speaker tonight.
Of course. And thank you, Yafa. That was great housekeeping. And you're so warm about it too. And yes, I just put the blurb about Gateways in the chat. I am the CEO of Gateways Access to Jewish Education. And I'm thrilled that we're partnering together with Yachad to bring you Jodi Samuels. Some of you may know her or may have read her memoir. It is a privilege for me to have the opportunity to introduce you, Jodi. She is our speaker for tonight. And besides her lovely South African accent, Jodi is an author, a speaker, a supermom, and wife living in Jerusalem. And when we scheduled this, she was supposed to be in America this week, but she actually is still in Jerusalem. So thank you for the time difference and still planning to be with us tonight. And you'll be able to see she's got a ton of passion for what she does as a not-for-profit leader, as a community activist, as a disability advocate and entrepreneur. She's also got a fabulous sense of humor, which is oftentimes just as important as a passion. So Jodi, we look forward to hearing you share your perspective on what this is entitled, How Life Does Not Have to Be Perfect to Be Wonderful. So I hope everyone enjoyed tonight. We'll open it up, as Yafa said, for Q&A at the end, but feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. So Jodi, the proverbial floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tamara, and thank you, Yafa, Liz. Thank you for making this venue possible. Gateways, Yachad, OU, and really to all of you who are on here listening, because for me, it's really a great opportunity to be able to share my story and my passion. And before I get into my story and sharing with you my perspective on life and it not having to be perfect, to be wonderful, I want to just I dedicate all my talks to my mom, who passed away in May this past year from Corona, unfortunately. And it was one of those crazy scenarios, being locked in Israel, and South Africa was considered a red country. But I'm very grateful that I got to South Africa when I did. And one of the things, I was sitting in the Shiva house, and my mother had been a public school teacher for like 25 years. And I knew my mother as this really strict teacher. People knew her as this old-fashioned school teacher. And of course, as a kid, I knew her as Mrs. Newman, the very scary teacher. And I never saw another side. That was my narrative. But my mom was, in fact, an orphan from a young age, and she grew up in an orphanage. And she was not someone who easily knew how to show love. But sitting in this shiva, there were so many people who walked in and they came to give their credit to her for being an educator. And people walked in, neighbors, and they were like, I don't know, for those of you who know about South Africa, it's falling apart. And there were so many things that don't work. My mother was always the person complaining to the municipality to get the lawn mowed and street lights working. And the neighbors were like, who's going to be the activist? Who's going to be the person who fights for the neighborhood? And then we had a gardener who worked for my family for 35 years, and he was crying, and he had come and he was an illegal when he arrived in South Africa, and she had helped him find work, and she was his defender and his protector. And all my cousins joined these Zoom shivers from around the world. And my mother was the youngest of 8 children. I have a lot of older cousins, and they were like, your mother organized my Shiva Brachot, and your mother organized my bar mitzvah, and your mother hosted my 25th wedding anniversary. And suddenly I saw my mother through a whole new light. And I understood that my mother actually gave, maybe not through love and emotion, because she didn't know how to show that, but she gave through her action. She gave the true meaning of love. And fast forward, I came back from the Shiva, and I went to shul on the first Friday, and I was speaking to a friend, and I said, I'm going home to host. And she's like, wow, I can't believe you're hosting people already. And I said to her, yes, of course. My parents always hosted guests. My mother would want me to host. I'm not in Shiva. I'm not, mourning on Shabbat. And she said, Jodi, you dedicated your book to some other lady, but what you've told me about your mom, really, it was your mom who influenced you. And I had this moment when I suddenly realized that actually my mother did influence me. And I had been stuck in my 18-year-old narrative. When I became religious, my parents weren't religious, and I was stuck in a narrative. And I dedicated my book to a Holocaust survivor who really impacted my life. But I learned that lesson, and this was only last year, May. It was probably the most profound lesson that I learned in this journey. And that is, sometimes we get stuck in our stories. Sometimes we get stuck in a narrative. And sometimes for us, the most important lesson or the most important moment in moving on is sometimes moving outside of that story, getting out of that conversation. So I'd been writing this crazy blog for years. People were like, Jodi, you should write a book. I have this crazy life. I've been to 87 countries. We travel kosher, Shomer Shabbat, with our children, on a budget. We host thousands of people. So BC, before COVID, we always had thousands of people in our home. Every Shabbat during the week, literally open door, people in and out. And I run an organization for young professionals around the world. I made Aliyah, and I'm very honest about my Aliyah journey, and I write about my daughter. I never did anything. I never wrote a book until I was in Morocco. So this Holocaust survivor had influenced me so much, passed away, and I went straight from her funeral to take one of my young professional groups on a heritage trip to Morocco. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Marrakesh, but the way they host Shabbat is families host, like kosher families, host groups in their home, a bit like the Samuel's home in Jerusalem. And we were in the Shabbat meal, and I'm famous for making l'chaims, and I wanted to make a l'chaim to Mrs. Vachla. At the Shabbat table, it was my group of 25 mixed, some religious, some not religious, some people sneaking in photos in the middle of the meal. And there was a group of 30 Hasidim from Lakewood, New Jersey. And it was one of their birthdays, and he had brought out all his friends. And they were sitting in a separate area. And I started telling my story, and I see all these Hasidic men looking at me. And I'm thinking, yeah, I know, I don't look like you. I don't look like your wives. And they're all staring at me. And I told a little bit about my journey. And they said, afterwards, they came and told me this was the most impactful story. This, I learned more today than all the years in yeshiva. You should really write a book. And I came home that day and I decided I am going to write a book and I'm going to dedicate my story. And that was another lesson for me, because I had been planning to write this book for a very long time, but it was just in my calendar. Monday and Wednesdays, I was going to Opine. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I was writing the book. But really, part of my lesson as well was that when you commit, so many things come out of it. So here is my journey that I'm going to share with you. I promise I can make people really laugh and cry in the same moment. But it's also really a true story. And it's really a message about changing your reality. I was born in Jewish Johannesburg. We were not religious at all. Basically, my definition of Jewish was meaning instead of wanting to be like the Joneses, we wanted to be like the Goldbergs. And we did not do anything Jewish except that we lived in a Jewish neighborhood. My mother taught in a Jewish day school, and we were the family that people would walk past on a Saturday morning. We were getting in our car, and all these religious kids would walk past and they'd go, "Good Shabbos, Mrs. Newman." And I would look at these religious kids and I'd go like, I'm never going to be one of them. Those people, the frummies, the nerds. And then I met a cute guy on the school bus. And he said to me, "So, Miss Newman, will I see you at shul?" And my Jewish journey really started all for a cute guy thinking I'm going to see him at synagogue. In those days, kids from South Africa did not go to Israel for a gap year, and definitely not kids who were not religious. I convinced my parents to let me go to Israel. I'm aging myself. There was the Gulf War, and I landed up in London. I was running out of money. My parents were adamant, sort of like the kids last year in the midst of Corona, who all their parents didn't think they should waste the year, but they were adamant to still have the year. I really did not want to go back to South Africa. And my mother mentioned in the staff room that her daughter was in England, and one of the staff members said, "My parents live in London, maybe they'll host her." And I walked in, and it was this Holocaust survivor. They saw me. They said, "So, are you hungry?" And I was starving, but I was a polite South African. I said no. They insisted I eat a meal, and they became my friends. But they were like my rabbi, my friend. They were the people who gave me so much guidance in my life. But they also, I always said to them, I was staying at them. I didn't even have money to buy a bottle of wine. And I said, "How am I ever going to repay you?" And they said, "The best gift you can give is you can do this for other people." And I don't think they realized this would be the gift that would keep giving. I started an organization 20 years ago. We reached thousands of young Jewish professionals. We've had 135 marriages. I was in Israel. I was swinging the pendulum. I was religious. I wasn't religious. I went backpacking. And then I landed up coming back to Israel. No money, really short skirt. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to be religious, but there was a free youth hostel in the old city. I arrived in the base of the old city at the bottom of the stairs. If anyone's been there, there's a lot of stairs all the way up. Cute soldier in uniform. And when you're 18, and a tall, dark, handsome soldier in uniform offers to carry your bag, you think you've died and gone to heaven. This guy landed up being, I started speaking to him. He was the most interesting guy I'd ever met. We got engaged. My parents were dead against it. Here I am, 18, really confused. And I'm sitting talking to a friend, and another person walks past, and we're on Ben Yehuda Street. He says, "Excuse me, do you speak English?" I answered with a good South African accent. And guess what? That was my husband, Gavin. And he says he also did not grow up religious. He had just been to Israel for his first time. He put a note in the wall. He said he wanted to meet his wife. And he said, "You go to head office and the next day you get your service." And I'm telling you this, guys, because this is part of a journey that really impacted me. We wanted to live in Israel. I told him on my second date, I wanted to have an open home. I wanted to live in Israel. He agreed. And here we are. We moved. We didn't have any money. We had student loans, and there's like a journey doctors take. I think there's some South African doctors also in your community, and they go live in these outback areas and you earn money and you can pay off your loans. And we have these crazy stories of being like newly married, and my mikveh was the like South Antarctic Ocean. And but we lived in Australia in these most outback places. We lived in New Zealand. And then we won green cards. By the time we got to New York, we had lived in 9 cities, in 5 countries, in 27 apartments. And we get to New York City in 2000. And within 3 weeks, someone asked me if I'd host a Shabbat meal for foreign Jews who were studying at Columbia University doing their MBA. And I hosted them for a Rosh Hashanah meal. And I had 36 people from 30 countries. And I had this epiphany that Jewish people needed this Jewish home away from home. And here we are, living in New York, and we had great jobs. Our first 2 children were born in New York. And people would have called us pillars of the community. We literally had an open door. We were like Grand Central Station. People would walk in and out of our apartment all the time. And I really, really, like I say this, but singles used to really be, when we grow up, we want to be just like Gavin and Jodi. February 25th, 2008, a doctor walked into the room when I had had my 3rd child, Kayla. And he said the 5 words that changed my life. Mrs. Samuels, did you do genetic testing? I had terror. I knew what he was going to ask me. For some reason, I had had this mother's intuition that there was something wrong in the pregnancy. I remember where I was very distinctly. I remember where I was sitting, and I came home and I told my husband. And my husband is like an old style doctor. And to him, if there isn't like evidence and if it isn't a double-blind study, then it doesn't exist. And he told me, but all the tests are fine. Everything's fine. And I was like, no, something's wrong. And he's like, well, all the tests are fine. And I was like, well, you don't see autism and you don't see all these things in a test. And I made him come with me to the OBGYN. And I was crying. And she was like, you're so stoic and there's nothing wrong. But somehow my mother's intuition had told me. And when they were preparing me for my cesarean, I wasn't praying like, please, God, give me a healthy child. I was like, please, God, give me the strength to deal with what comes my way. I just knew. But then my daughter was born and they gave her like a 9 on the APGAR scale and everything was great. And we sent out a message. We had 8,000 people on the database and we said, Mom and baby are doing well. And on day 4 of her life, a pediatrician walked in and he asked us if we had done genetic testing. And I sat bolt upright and I knew he was going to say Down syndrome. I actually have a first cousin with Down syndrome and we had a lot of family trauma. She was born in the 70s, in 1970. And in those days in South Africa, they counseled my aunt to put her in an institution. And it was a very tough thing for the family, but I definitely knew what Down syndrome was. I did not have to be educated. And I felt terror, absolute terror. I mean, all the thoughts that went through my head. How was I going to host all these thousands of guests? How was I going to travel all around the world? I hadn't even been, like I was this ambitious. I was going to be on front page of Fortune, Forbes, Business Week. I hadn't made it there yet. I was en route. What was this going to mean for her siblings? What was this going to mean for my marriage? And I went to the restroom and I looked in the mirror and it was the only place that I could be alone with my thoughts. And I had to say, who am I? What do I want from life? What does God want from me? I had had 2 miscarriages between Kayla and my other daughter. And I felt like God wanted me to have this neshama. But I also felt like we have this open home. Literally, everybody walks in and out of our home, everyone. And I was like, we have an open home for the lost, the lonely, the searching, every form of the world. I was like, and if you were God, wouldn't you give us this child? And I felt like if I could have an open home to a perfect stranger, but I couldn't have an open home and an open heart to my own child, then my life was a lie. And as a result of that honest conversation, like, what kind does the world need? Another business person? What kind of mom do I want to be? Wife? How am I going to be crazy Jodi juggling this all? But I also came to the conclusion I really had a choice. And right there and then, it was like, are we going to be victims or victors? And the words of Rabbi Sachs came to me. And he always said, we achieve greatness when we can pass our values on to the next generation. And I knew then that I really did not want Kayla to be a burden. I didn't want my other kids to see her as a burden. And I also knew we had an incredible opportunity to change an entire community's knee-jerk reaction to special needs. When we were leaving the hospital, they checked my husband's wristband, or both our wristbands. You know how they check just to make sure you're not stealing the baby? Well, as we were walking out, Gavin said to me, well, they may as well have branded activist on our forehead. Little did he know how prophetic those words would be when just exactly 2 days later, when Kayla was in the first week of her life, a neighbor walked in. A religious neighbor walked in, and she said, what? In her strong New York accent, which I can't imitate with my South African one, but she was like, what? You didn't do an amniocentesis and abort? And I'm like, no. Like, I'm holding the baby. Like, clearly I didn't abort the baby. And we soon realized people made some of the most stupid comments to us. In fact, Gavin, who has a little bit of a dry sense of humor, wanted to have a t-shirt made for Kayla that said, I have an extra copy of chromosome 21 that accounts for my mental retardation. What's your excuse? But really, for us, it was a situation of if we didn't like the reality we saw, then we knew we had to be the ones to change our reality. It wasn't that simple. It wasn't that I just got up and I was like smiley and so happy. Well, God gave me a child with special needs. I was very confused. I was like, why me? Why us? Why my family? In my professional life, as a business person, I actually help organizations scale up. And one of the first things I ask businesses is, what's your mission statement? What's your purpose for being? What do you do? Why do you exist? And I soon realized I needed a personal mission statement. In the Talmud, we're taught that a father's obligation is to teach his child to swim. But what does that really mean? It means a parent has the obligation to teach their child survival skills. And I realized I needed survival skills. I was swimming in a new reality and I needed survival skills. And I needed to know what was my mission, what was my purpose. And that set the framework for me for moving forward. When Kayla was 2 years old, we tried to get her into a community Jewish day school, a school that her siblings were at. They didn't want to meet us. They didn't want to interview us. And when we got there, you know, in the body language and the person sitting with their arms crossed, and the opening sentence was, you called this meeting, what do you want? And basically, we explained all we want is for our child to come and join a 2-year-old program, the same 2-year-old program her siblings had been in. And we were given all these bunches of excuses. And I was like, but Rabbi, the stated goal of your 2-year-old program is socialization and communication skills. We're not asking for guaranteed entry into first grade, into high school, into Harvard. We're asking for entry into a 2-year-old program. But we were told, well, we have to speak to experts. I waited and kept calling. And finally, they got back to me. And the rabbi called and said, Mrs. Samuels, we spoke to hundreds of professionals, and they unanimously agree that our school isn't the right place. I'm like, wow, Rabbi, hundreds of professionals? Not just like one professional? Can you name one person who actually assessed her, interviewed her, spoke to us? And yet you've got hundreds of people who are prepared to put their name on. And we had this whole conversation, and eventually the conversation went in circles about not having space, and they and those people and them. And I was like, but Rabbi, there are other children with a sayat, with a shadow. There's other. And eventually I just said, are you saying there's no room for a child with Down syndrome in your school? I was devastated because as someone who was a Baal Tshuva, for someone who had chosen this journey, had defied her parents, we had to figure out our own way, and we had chosen this path, and now I felt locked out. And I wasn't just feeling locked out of a school, because schools and shuls and the whole community are connected. I felt locked out, and I was devastated. All I wanted was for my child to stand in a chair and say a Devar Torah like these families I'd seen when I was becoming religious. I wanted my child to know the Hanukkah songs just like her siblings. And now we were locked out. Thank God for Gavin. He kept saying, Joe, don't judge Judaism by the Jews. We decided to take this further. So we asked for a meeting with the board of the school. And, you know, coincidentally, both the presidents of the board had Kayla, both the presidents of the board's children, had Kayla as this 6-year chesed project. In 6th grade, they have chesed projects. Guys, I can't tell you how much I hate chesed. I have entire talks in this of why I hate chesed. I don't hate chesed like in the true sense of what chesed's meant to be, but I hate this concept that we teach our children that you do an hour a day, tick, an hour a week, should I say, tick, chesed done, or we write a check, chesed done. No, that's not what we as families want. That's not what we want. We want people to open their hearts, their home, their schools, their shuls, their communities, not a chesed project of 1 hour a week and a tick. We begged them. And they told us nothing we say or do will change their minds. But we decided to leave them with what became our rallying cry and said, we're asking you to do not what's easy, but what's right. We got nowhere. We were blocked in every angle. And eventually I decided I wanted to send a message out to the community. And they had made a boo-boo, the school. They sent an email to the entire school, except they forgot to blind carbon copy. So I had the entire school email list, plus I had my 8,500 people on my database. And I decided to send a letter to the rabbi. I told my husband, my goal is to have our situation, the topic of discussion from gefilte fish to dessert, that Shabbat. And I sent a letter to the rabbi, but it was really addressed to the whole community. And I was like, dear rabbi, and I explained to him how we are really activist family and we hands-on and we full-fee paying parents, and she's going to come with a basket of services. You know, I'm sure many of you know that New York City, the time we're living in New York City, the envy of most places with all the basket of special needs services, we're coming with this entire basket of services. I said, but you know what, Rabbi? The main reason I'm asking you is for my son, Miran, who at the time was 8 years old. And I said, Rabbi, I'm going to tell you a story. So anybody who's lived in New York, you all know about the homeless people. Every street corner has a homeless person. If you didn't know about it since COVID, everybody knows about the homeless people in New York. So we had a homeless lady who lived in our street corner, and her name was Diane. And Diane knew all about the Orthodox Jews, and she would come on a Friday and she'd ask for $2 because she knew she couldn't get money on Shabbat, and on a 3-day Yontif, she knew it was a 3-day that she had to ask for more money. And she used to like always say, I don't know why Jewish people want to give me that earthy brown stuff on Saturday and Sunday, which must have been leftover cholent. And one day Gavin gave Diane $10. And Miran asked her, Abba, why did you give $10 today, not $1? And Gavin explained when it was freezing cold that one of the supers lets some of the homeless people sleep in the basement of the building, but they have to pay. So Miran said, Abba, next time, let Diane sleep in my bed, but don't tell Ima. So Gavin said, why not tell Ima? So he thought, Miran would say, oh, she's dirty. She's, we can't have someone like that in the house. And he said, Abba, because that's just what Jews do. And I said, Rabbi, I'm appealing to you. This is not about me. But one day, this little 8-year-old boy is going to say, where was my school? Where was my rabbi? Where was my community? I'm asking you to think about the impact on his decisions on her siblings as well. But we didn't make any progress. And, the situation turned rather ugly, and we got threats and accusations. And I remember being like in the supermarket and people coming up to me and saying, there was one woman, she attacked me and she's like, what do you think your children will think of you? And I said, you know what? I think that my children will always know that Ima, that mommy will go into bat for them. The situation was crazy. And I can tell you some of these things. I think this is why my book's called Chutzpah, Wisdom, and Wine. I needed wine for some of these situations. But someone told us to go speak to someone who was like a who's who in the community. And Gavin went to ask him, what should we do? Someone that Gavin went to shul with every day. What would you do? And he said, well, if it was my child, and he mentioned some non-Jewish school, and he said, you can send her to us for Hanukkah, and we'll let her light a Hanukkah candle or two. And for Purim, we'll give her half a homintash. And he walked off. But the real cherry on the top came when a board member of a modern Orthodox Jewish day school sent us a message saying, you chose to bring this problem into the world. Don't make your problem our problem. Guys, this is New York City. This is New York City, 2010, when everything goes. You can be gay, lesbian, you can be Black president of the United States of America. You can also be in the most liberal city, but apparently you couldn't choose whether you were going to keep your child. And I answered, God chose to bring this problem into the world. But at this point, I realized that somebody needs to do something about this. And it happened to be around Martin Luther King Day. And I saw a sign blown up. They had all these posters and it said, we begin to die when we're silent about things that matter. And I decided I'm going to run these community forums because I realized so many people in my inner circle didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what was happening to us. They didn't understand. In fact, the very first community forum, I think about 150 people showed up. Jeff Lickman, who's the head of Yachad, was actually one of the panelists. And I arrived there and there were all this media that were there. And this is New York. They love nothing more than a story of Orthodox Jews. And the media were there and there were all these like lights and media vans. And at the end, they wanted to interview me. And up to that point, I'd actually been really shy. I was really a behind the scenes person, but I never got up and spoke in public. And I said to Gavin, okay, Gav, you speak to the media. And he was like, no, you wanted to do this. You speak to the media. And I say that's when I had to find my voice. And now I became Mama Grizzly. So they unleashed in me a new Jodi. But really, the lesson for me was also when there's no man, sometimes you have to be the man. When there's no leader, you have to be the leader. Fast forward, we made Aliyah. We spoke about it for 23 years. And then in 2 weeks, we moved to Israel. I say that I cried a lot more making Aliyah than I did when I got the diagnosis of my daughter. It was a much harder thing for me to accommodate to. In fact, I say my Aliyah mantra was, God, give me coffee to deal with the things I can and wine to deal with the things I can't. But, you know, we moved to Israel, and with Kayla came new challenges, new issues, whole different set of reasons why inclusion was difficult. Right now, Kayla, thank God, she's doing really well. She just started 7th grade in a local high school. She learned Hebrew within 6 months. She was fluent in Hebrew and English. And I've been there 7 years, and I don't have Down syndrome, and I definitely can't speak Hebrew like she can. And, you know, she's been having sleepovers since she was age 3. In fact, this last summer, she was at Moshava with the Yachad program for 4 weeks. And Kayla's amazing. But people ask me, Jodi, how did you get the strength to be unstoppable? In fact, my hashtag is unstoppable. How did I get the strength? And there were 2 fundamental things for me in this journey. And one was, when you cannot change your reality, you have to change your perspective. And the second one was just understanding that this was a test. And in Judaism, we know that Judaism doesn't try and pitch to be a religion of tranquility. You know, when we're in the Tibetan mountains and you see these monks meditating, and then you go to your yeshiva and you hear the struggle for truth and the loud noise where people are studying. Like, Judaism is a religion where we struggle with truth. We know that from the tests of Abraham to the imot, to the mothers, the trials and tribulations. I always joke that we're always nervous about what our children are watching on TV, and we protect them, yet they come home from school with the Pasha, the weekly Torah portion, and they learn about wars and rape and murders and deceit. But ultimately, you know, we don't learn about the, you know, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah sitting on a Caribbean beach drinking cocktails. We learn about the trials and tribulations. And I understood that I was going through a test. And these tests are for spiritual growth, and they give you emotional muscle. And I remember I was going to the kotel. And I guess as, you know, someone who didn't grow up religious, and for me, I was like, I don't know, like I really had this urge. I needed to speak to God, and I had to go to the kotel. I had to be there, and I was going to be like, why us? Why our family? Why me? But by the time we got there, 6 months later, after Kayla was born, I had already grown from my test. I had already understood that I had a purpose in this journey. And people say to me, the name Chutzpah, Wisdom and Wine, is it a meaning in your book? Well, it's not just like a catchy name. For me, Chutzpah, Wisdom and Wine is a life philosophy. Many of you might think of Chutzpah, people think of it as like Israeli Chutzpah, they say. They think of it as like boldness, arrogance. But there's another side of Chutzpah. In fact, you just think of the startup nation and it can help you understand it. But really, Chutzpah is the lack of the fear of the word no. And when you're a mama of a special needs kid, you have to not be scared of the word no. You have to be willing to confront and change things. It's also about having passion. It's about self-awareness. It's about an ability to cope. Chutzpah, for me, is also an appreciation that it's the journey and not only the destination. It's about understanding that rules, and if anybody knows Israel, rules are starting points of a negotiation. But I really think the most defining criteria of chutzpah, and the most defining thing for me of chutzpah, is truly believing that tomorrow will always be better. So wisdom, for me, is Judaism. So I don't always speak to Jewish groups and I say that you have to tap into what your wisdom is. But for me, it's Torah wisdom. I didn't grow up with a lot of religion, and I haven't religious studies, and I didn't study a lot since I found Judaism. But what I do know has very much driven me, given me the guide. And we only have to look at like the last couple of years between Israeli elections and US elections and vaccines and COVID, and you can switch between CNN and Fox and get whiplash just going between these to realize how much information's out there and how the world changes. And maybe our parents used Dr. Spock, old-fashioned parenting, and now if you like hit your kid, you could be arrested, and the world changes all the time. But Torah wisdom is finite, and it's always there. And for me, it's always been my driving force. And wine for me, well, wine obviously has that like spiritual connotation, and in Judaism, it has a lot of sacrificial purposes. But I have a very, very strong theory in life about work hard and party hard. I've been married 28 years. We go out every single night of our lives. But I truly, truly believe that we have to stop. And, you know, they say when you're on an airplane, they give the analogy that if you need to put on an oxygen mask, they always say the parent should put the oxygen mask on themselves first, and then they put it on their child. Because you need to be able to breathe. You need that strength in order to help your child. And I really believe, to me, wine, while I love wine and I drink wine and I'm famous for my l'chaims, it's about that taking that time out. It's about stopping. It's about appreciating your blessings in life. And it's about playing and getting off that treadmill, because we so often are the mom and the entrepreneur and the boss and the teacher. And then in COVID, we became the psychologist and the laundry lady and the, you know, Zoom connector and homework doer. And we have so many roles. But sometimes we just never stop for ourselves. And I think parents, especially parents of children with disabilities, are sometimes the ones that never, ever stop. And you're always in mode and you're always in your role. And ladies, gentlemen, a good glass of red wine. Since March 2020, we've all seen that the only thing we know for sure in life is that we know absolutely nothing for sure. It's about the only thing we know. We know nothing. And it's been chaotic, and we've all had to learn. I don't think there's anybody on the planet who hasn't had to learn to pivot in the face of change. We may all know this because we're all veterans already of having to deal with this. But I really thank Kayla for teaching me this lesson long before COVID, that life doesn't have to be perfect to be wonderful. And to all the kids that are out there, and to all the warrior parents that are out there, we all know that we wouldn't change our children for the world, but we would change the world for them. So thank you, everyone. I really am on my own mission to change the world. I know I can't change the world, the whole big wide world, but I can change my corner of the world. And I started Jodi's Voice to challenge mindsets, to inspire greatness. And I'm happy to come speak in your communities, your schools, shuls. I speak on many topics. This is just like an intro topic. I run workshops. I'm happy to share with you. You guys can check out my website, Jodi's Voice. Please read my book. You can have some good laughs and some good cries and have a glass of wine while you're reading it. And with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions you have. And I'm happy to be honest questions. And I'm totally fine with any question put to me on the table.
Jodi, thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm checking the chat to see if anyone's writing in. And just, if there are any questions for you. One question that I know I had for you myself, it really resonated to me what you shared about in 2008, 2010, that you felt locked out. And it's incredible to me because I was thinking, wait, she said the baby was born in 2008. Like that's that's in the 2000s. We're not talking the 1970s. We're not talking the 1990s. And even here in Boston, with what Gateways does, making sure we have inclusive access to Jewish education, and with Yachad, making sure that everyone has an opportunity to have access to Jewish life and learning. And yet we still meet with this all the time. I mean, even for myself, for my own child with a disability, we were told that he could not continue in a daycare because of the developmental delays that he had. And I'm struck by, at what point did you decide you had to leave instead of staying to continue to advocate to change in the community in New York City that you were living in? Because that, not everyone is able to just pick up and move and find something different. And that's what I wanted to ask you, if I can.
Sure. So firstly, I want to be clear that our decision to move to Israel, we only moved to Israel 2014. And while I definitely think that it played a part in the decision, I think it was very, very hard for especially my husband. For a man, he goes to shul and he interacts with the community in a much more, mine was a more casual level of interaction. Like I go for a kiddush, but he, get there 10 minutes before shul ends. But I remember there was this moment that he went to shul, and the same person who had been so dismissive of was like the Bal Koreh and Rosh Hashanah. He was the person reading the Torah. And he said, how could this person be like representing me? And I do think we felt locked out even after we had maybe moved on. It definitely played a part. But I will tell you that I moved my kids' schools. And I'll share with you two very significant things, because firstly, we brought on a lawyer, and he's a disability activist. Some of you may know him, Richard Bernstein. He's right now a Supreme Court judge in Michigan. He happens to be one of my very closest friends, long before we were locked out of school. And Richard took on our case, and that probably what made it come to the headlines so much, because Richard took on our case. In fact, we connected with Gateways back then but I think for me, we were going to fight this. We were going to fight this to the absolute end. And firstly, I'm not sure the recourse in the end was the recourse I wanted, because we could have fought it and made the school take Kayla. But did we really want to go somewhere where they didn't want her? That was part one. But part two, I just remember there was this moment. Miron was 8 years old, and Miron's been parenting us since he was born. So he was like this really mature kid and very serious. And he came home and he said to me one day, Ima, every time I see the rabbi, the principal of the school, I want to ask him what the story is with the Kayla situation. But he goes, I'm a little bit embarrassed. And I remember thinking to myself, you know what, this is my fight. This is my passion, but this isn't his fight. And he was getting dragged in, and he was getting dragged in for the wrong reasons. And at the time, another school, SAR, which is a community day school in Riverdale, I did not want to send my daughter to a different borough. I was like, I live in Manhattan, the wealthiest zip code in the world, and, one of the wealthiest zip codes, and she's coming with all these basket of services. And I felt it was like this grave injustice that they weren't taking her. And why should she have to go to a school in another borough? And I was like very adamant. And that moment when Miran told me that, something clicked in me. And I realized that this is my fight, and I have to continue this fight, but I have to move my children to a place where they're going to get the values we believed in. So that was very significant. And I have to say that we lived on 97th Street in Manhattan, and there was a Chabad on 97th Street. But we just never went to Chabad. It just wasn't us. We had never been there. And they had a preschool. So, of course, now I don't have a place for Kayla. And I go to the Chabad, and I walk in there, and I had filled in an intake form, and the principal's meeting us. And the first question she said to me was, oh, can I ask you a question? You have two other older children, but they never came to our school. Do you mind telling me how come now you're thinking of Chabad? And my lips started quivering. And I was like, oh, because they don't want us. And I burst into tears. And she stopped me right there and then. And she said, Jodi, this interview is over. Every child has the right to a Jewish education. Your daughter's accepted. And I think that it said so much to me between SAR and Chabad that so much of inclusion came from the leadership. And, you know, when water's tainted at its source, water's tainted. And it was amazing that the same basket of services, the same size classroom, the same full fee paying parents in one school were welcome. And not only did we see that, but the whole community, like when the school took on the approach that these families were part of our community and they were welcome. Before my kids, you know, before the kids went to SAR, they held they had one day where all the teachers had to come in the day before school started. All the parents were invited. They let us speak about inclusion. And everybody was like on the team of Samuels, you know, like, yes, we believe in inclusion. But that message came from the top. So sometimes you just have to follow where the leadership has got the right vision. You know, moving to Israel was more like an idealistic, Zionistic dream that we were following. It wasn't running away from the inclusion. In fact, I wish sometimes we hadn't gone to SAR because it was very hard to leave such a warm, inclusive environment.
Thank you for sharing that. We do have other questions. Yafa, I know you have a bunch, and then I also have a few more also. So Yafa, why don't you get the next one?
I'm going to ask you two together. One is about how has your and Gavin's activism shaped Kayla's own self-esteem and ability to advocate for herself? And the second part of that, kind of related, is what is the relationship among all your children, and how has this experience shaped your other children's sense of self?
So, you know, personally, I sometimes question and I say, has our activism even moved the needle at all? And I really believe, you know, it's hard because you like fight so hard and sometimes you don't always see change. I think that as a parent, I look at the parents before me who are the pioneers who maybe fought, and based on their activism, we have the opportunities we do. And I hope that maybe even if our fight doesn't necessarily change the world so much for Kayla, we can change it for the future, just like people before me changed it for me. So it's hard to sometimes realize that you might only move the needle a little bit in your way. The one thing I do think that our activism did, I think that we gave other people the confidence to feel they should also have a voice. Instead of everybody feeling they didn't have a voice, sometimes you just need someone to say, this isn't okay, and you lead the change and other people stand up. But let's call it evolutionary rather than revolutionary in terms of change. You know, it's slow. In terms of Kayla, you know, she's like more the kid who's like, she thinks she's famous because of it. So, you know, she loves the fact that everybody knows about her. But Kayla has a really incredible self-image. And I mentioned in the beginning, we always host these very big groups for Shabbat. And she's grown up like getting up in front of 50 people and talking and giving a Devar Torah, and that's since she was 3. But one of the things Kayla always says, and I love my family, and I love God, and I love myself. And that's her like favorite. And I always think to myself, like, she has such a strong sense of self. I deal with many normal people, you know, I deal with young professionals, many with like, you know, typical people, so to speak, and they don't love themselves. And Kayla's very comfortable saying, I love myself, and she loves God, and she believes she has a place in the world. So I hope somewhere it's trickled down in her belief. With regard to my other kids, look, they're very aware that they're a sibling of a child with a disability. And you see these things come out right from a young age. I remember once we had gone to South Africa, and it was like a 17-hour flight from New York, and we arrived like just Erev Seder and, you know, late night. And the next day we in shul, and Kaylee was cranky and she was crying. And a kid said to Tamira, why is your sister crying? And I think the kid didn't have any clue that Kayla had Down syndrome or anything. She was just asking, why is your sister crying? And Tamira was like, my sister has Down syndrome. And she started explaining, she's like, and if you have more questions, you can ask my mom. She's sitting right there. And I like just realized she's like always wearing this label on her. You know, she was so hyper aware that she couldn't actually separate the fact that this is just tired and cranky and she's crying because she's tired. But I do think that my kids are shaped for it. And an example would be Meron was very friendly with these in-crowded kids at school. And one day, this was before we made Aliyah, I said to him, oh, you haven't seen so-and-so for a long time. How come you're not friends with those kids? And he said, Ima, there was a new kid who came to our school, and he mentioned the name. And this kid had actually been to our house many times. And he goes, all the kids are really horrible to him and no one talks to him. So I felt like I had to be his friend. And then when I was his friend, no one wanted to be my friend. And he never told us about it. It like just came out in a conversation. And I don't think he would have had the sensitivity. It's hard to be like a 11-year-old boy and give up on being in the in crowd. So I assume, you know, they have a sensitivity that comes from being in this situation. I don't think it's easy for them, but I do think my kids know that we'll fight for them no matter what. It's not just Kayla. And I think that they're very aware that they will always have a role in co-parenting her at some point, because it takes a team. You know, if this is like when they say it takes a village to raise a child, well, definitely a child with a disability takes a village, and a lot of that village is the nuclear family in our world. So,
100%. Tamar, can I ask another question? Okay. One question that came in, is it easier in Israel to acclimate a special needs child to general education versus New York? And part two is, what services did your daughter receive that you thought were helpful?
Okay, so the Israel question is not a simple one, because it's a whole set of different issues there. I really believe that when you live in a society, and even though in many ways Israel is a secular society, there's a value for a life. The same army that sends, you know, people in to like just try and get a body part back, there's that value of a life. There's a value of a human being. And I don't believe that we would be confronted with the same questions of like, you chose to bring this child into the world, don't make your problem ours. But at the same time, you can't compare the resources of coming from a private Jewish day school and a basket of New York City services to what you get in Israel. As my kids taught me very early on in Israel, Ima, you get what you get and you don't be upset, which is much more of the services. So we got a lot more open-mindedness and a lot less services as part of our package. In Israel, it's very hard to do inclusion for a whole set of different reasons. Partly, there just isn't the resources. So how many families are there? There's like, we have a Down syndrome WhatsApp group of like English speakers, and there's all these different groups. I know of about 12 families who are doing true inclusion. I'm not talking about like inclusion where the kids are in school and they join for like gym and art projects. And I'm talking about true inclusion where a kid's genuinely included in a classroom with a modified curriculum for their child. There's not many. And part of that is because you have to provide so many outside services. In Israel, if you put your kid in the special ed environment, which is fantastic in some ways, you now have a Jewish special ed environment, which isn't always possible in a place like America. But if you want to do inclusion, you don't really get a whole lot of services. So to put in perspective, I walked away from New York. We were getting 25 hours a week of a special education itinerant teacher, which was a master's degree teacher. She was in a class that was 25 hours a week. She got through her Medicaid waiver additional support hours, 15 hours a week, that we could use for someone could do homework with her, teach her to tie her shoelaces or help her in school, whatever we needed the support for. In addition to that, she had OT, PT, speech therapy. We had all these services coordinated in our private Jewish day school. We also had a social worker from Medicaid waiver program that advocated, signed our forms, did everything. Well, we got to Israel and guess who became CEO of the intervention team? me, and I don't speak the language. So a lot of the stress was transferred to me. Well, we were paying for private Jewish day schools. We're now paying private support that we didn't pay. So it's definitely, you know, other challenges, definitely a more open-minded experience. And I'll use the first day of kindergarten in Israel. I call up this teacher, never met her before, heard they have like partly English speaking program, call her up, tell her that my daughter has Down syndrome. She goes, "Ani lo pecheret, I'm not scared." And that was it. Kayla comes, first day, no real intake, we have a meeting. When we were like in New York, you had to have like a special shadow. Someone had to come in the class and the teacher was out and you couldn't have less than 3 teachers with 20 kids. There, they left 25 kids with 1 teacher. And the teacher comes in to have this meeting. And I remember like trying to give her some instructions about Kayla. And she looked at me like I'd fallen off a wagon. Like, she's like, "Oh, we don't insist that kids wash their hands." And, just things that for me were like so important. And it was a different experience. In terms of services that helped Kayla so much, there were so many. I actually think that one of the most significant things that we got was we started taking Kayla to a place called the Self-Esteem Institute in Jerusalem before we even made Aliyah. And, they have a very strong philosophy of inclusion, but they really believe in the potential of each person. And for me, that wasn't just the therapy they gave Kayla, but it was the perspective and the education they gave us on really believing that tomorrow is possible. And Professor Feuerstein put out a book, and I think it defines so much of our philosophy. And his philosophy of the subject of the book, the title of the book, is, "If you love me, don't accept me as I am." And that's the opposite of so much of what the special needs world's about, which is passive acceptance versus active acceptance. Passive acceptance is like, God gave me a special needs child. We have no choice. And we're going to give the child the best services. We're going to do whatever. Active acceptance is, God gave me a special needs child, and I am going to constantly work on this child to make this child the best, absolute best person that this child can be. Just like you do with your typical kids. And I say our typical kids, especially when they have Jewish parents, always are 110% achievers, whatever their potential is. Well, it's no different with your child with a disability. Expect from this child, move the goals. And what he told us, for the first time we met him when Kayla was 6 months old, he said, "You know what you can expect from Kayla? Tertiary education and to get married." And he said, "Promise to invite me." He was 94. He said, "It promised to invite me to the chuppah." But he said, "Promise me something else. You'll never be disappointed that she doesn't achieve the goals." And I think that's it. It's about really believing it's possible without being disappointed when it's harder to get there or you don't get there. And that's a very different life philosophy to sometimes what the message we put out in the special needs world.
Mm-hmm. Jodi, this is incredible to hear all of your different perspective. We have a few more questions, but we're going to do one more question before we wrap up. So the question that I'm choosing, because I am very curious myself, is how you balance the needs of all of your children, that they don't resent Kayla and the amount of focus she receives, either because of her needs or your visibility, or her visibility from your activism.
So
it's a big question.
It's a big question because I definitely don't think we've been perfect at it. And as my kids are older and they like express more, I think they do think that Kayla, and it comes out even in little things. So like there's like an anecdote, but it sometimes explains so a kid asked Kayla to meet her, and she comes from like this wealthy family, and they wanted to go out for dinner. So usually like Israeli kids, when they like meet, that means they're going to go and grab a slice of pizza or like a falafel. So anyway, my husband gave Kayla 100 shekels, not expecting her to spend 100 shekels. So where did these kids go? They went to a proper sit-down place and ordered pasta. And Gavin was like, "Kayla, where's my change?" And she's like, no, I only have 4 shekels change. He's like, what? You spent 100 shekels? Anyway, my like teenage daughter was sitting there to me, and she's like, that's not fair. I never got 100 shekels when I went out. And we're like, yeah, but you didn't have Down syndrome. But like, and I mean, I say that tongue in cheek, but she had lots of friends. Like, this wasn't this unique once in a lifetime experience that some kid actually asked her out spontaneously, and, you know, that we wanted to make it as like easy and as special for Kayla as possible. She was so excited about it. So I do think sometimes like the resentment comes out because maybe we have different measures of how we give. I think the most important thing, at least my husband and I believe, I hope we're right, only time will tell, but is we believe that you have to spend quality time with all your children, and you have to try and address your children's needs. And there's not even a question. If I would have put as much time into my other kids as I put into Kayla for school and everything, they would have been beyond genius. But, you know, I never did. And, you know, I think there's times when my kids understand why we do it. And I think there's times when they're like, well, it's not fair. And there's times when they think, well, rather her have Down syndrome than me. You know, I think it's like all these conflicting emotions. But the best we can do as parents is show them that we love them. We'll always be for them. Issues that are important for them are important for us. But, you know, as someone said to me, you can never always win with teenagers regardless. So I hope, I hope we're making right choices, but it is hard because they are very much aware of it.
Thank you, Jodi. I know that's a tough question to answer. I feel the same, being a person with a disability myself, and then also I think about it obviously for my own child. So thank you for answering so openly. And now I'll turn it over to Liz, to our Liz Oppen, our Yachad director, and my wonderful colleague, to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Jodi. We are so grateful for you spending the evening with us, the morning on your end. But I think your message that striving to be perfect really can lead to an imbalance in one's life and not the best interest of your children, and not having the strength for the long haul, right? Because this is a lifelong requirement that you be there to support not only that one child, but your whole family. And I think also your message about working and giving each child quality time. And the last thing that I would say we at Yachad really believe in is that we see every individual with disabilities as a whole person. And I think that that's so important, that we set goals and expectations for them to achieve, and we help the community to see them as a whole person. And that's part of what we do as an ambassador for our own children. And we put in the chat for everyone how you can find Jodi's website and her book. And I think, Yafa, if you can also add her email, would be great. And I know Jodi wants to be available to everyone to answer further questions or engage you in conversation. And we're just very grateful again that you could be with us this evening. So yep, there's all your contact information. So friends here, thank you for joining us this evening. Jodi, you get the last word.
So thank you, everyone. And, you know, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to connect with you and speak with you, and would love to get to know you all more. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you again, friends.
Thank you, everyone. Happy, healthy 2022.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you. Laila Tov.